Welcome to React Essentials. We're going to go through some very fundamental, basic, essential knowledge when working with React. If you're using React daily, you're probably already familiar with a lot of this. If you're not frequently using React or you haven't used it for a while, it's probably going to be a pretty good refresher. All of these examples will use TypeScript just because I feel it is easier to communicate what's going on in the examples. And you should probably be using TypeScript when writing React anyway. So we're going to start off talking about declaring components and the different ways you can do it. And we'll start off with a class component. So I've got a class here, Airline Food. We're extending a component from React. And we've got some state, and we've got a render method with a return statement in which we're returning some JSX. And so when you're using a class component, you're inheriting from the base component class of React. And all you need to do here is implement the render method state, and everything else is completely optional. But the render method is what you absolutely must have. Next up, we've got a function component. This is generally speaking how it will look when it's declared. It may use the function keyword instead of const, of course. But generally this is the most common way to declare one. There's nothing to implement because we're not inheriting from the base component class. We're just creating a function component here. And all you need to do is return valid JSX. And next, I've got an example of a function component with state. And to a lot of people, this is old news, but it's probably been maybe a little less than a year now that you can actually have state in a function component. They were previously known as stateless function components, but now they're just function components because they can have state. Then we're using useState, which is a hook. These all came in React 16.8. We're talking about this a lot more in the future, but this is just to show that you can have and manage state in a function component. Next up, we have props and state. So this is pretty fundamental to React. Make sure if you understand anything from this, it's probably props and state or what comes next. So props are passed from a parent to a child component, and they are immutable. You cannot change them in the child component. Whereas state is typically managed by a component and it can be changed, and its value is maintained between renders, and that's true of class and function components. Next, we're going to talk about the component lifecycle, in which there are three phases. The first is mounting, the second, which can occur many times, is updating, and finally unmounting. And just to demonstrate how that all works, I'm going to use class components because I think in that way it's a bit easier to understand, especially if you're new to React. This is probably a little bit easier than going straight into the way it works in a function component. And I'll also note that I'm only going to cover the most important lifecycle methods that a class has. I'm not going to talk about the whole list of them because there are a tremendous amount. We'll start off with mounting naturally. So here's a class component with a constructor, and component did mount and render, and that's the order that they're called in. Constructor first, which generally speaking, you probably don't need, and we'll talk about this later as well. Then component did mount is called. And typically you would use this to fire off network requests or subscribe to a data source of some kind, maybe set up some timers, any work like that needs to be done straight away. And then finally, the component is rendered. Next up, for updating, we have component did update. And so in this, and this is only applicable to a class component, you are able to access the previous props and state as they were in that class, as well as the current or what will be rendered values of props and state. And so you can use that to make decisions about, does this need to change or do I need to get that data, and so on. And then finally, after that's completed, you've got render once more, where the component updates. And finally, we have unmounting. And there's really only one interesting method to talk about when it comes to unmounting, and that's component will unmount. This is where you would typically clean up anything that needs to be cleaned up. So any subscriptions, or you need to clear some intervals or timeouts or what have you. Anything, I guess a good way to think about it is anything that might cause a memory leak that needs to be disposed, this is where you do it. And so on the topic of life cycles and classes, My directive here is to use what you need. You probably never need a constructor. So just looking at this code sample that we have here, we've got a constructor, we're passing in props, as is tradition and convention and required. Then we're declaring our starting state with open is false. And then we've got getFood equals this dot getFood dot bind with this as the argument. We're binding that method to this class, but you don't actually need any of this. In fact, you can declare the state outside of the constructor and it will work just fine. It will be identical. Similarly, if you were to declare the getFood method with the arrow syntax or lambda syntax or fat arrow syntax, whatever you call it, it's automatically bound. And so by moving state out and just changing the way we declare getFood, we can actually scrap the constructor entirely. You should always aspire to do this. And look, it's really a legacy thing. You will see this in older React projects. So it's good to be aware of what it is and what it's doing. And also to know that it's very easy, convenient, and most importantly of all, it's safe to refactor. Next up, we're going to talk about how React is functional-ish, which is to say that there's no mutation. Any side effects need to be managed and called explicitly. And you need to get used to returning a whole lot of new copies of data. So here I've got the most sort of classic example that I could think of in terms of the marriage of React and functional programming, which is using map. We're iterating over a functor, or in this case, it's probably an array of strings, I would argue. So on each render, that data is mapped over and it is returned as a new copy effectively. It's important to be aware of this for a few reasons. The first is that this is how you write idiomatic React. You can use a for loop in there, but you probably won't. And it would be very strange and unusual to see that. When using React and/or Redux, you're only ever going to be creating new state, excluding that one case where you're changing what's in state in a class. Your side effects will need to be explicit, and specifically for Redux, it really does make debugging very, very, very tremendous and beautiful and elegant. It's also potentially representative of a shift in labor market skills, because a lot of new developers, especially web devs, they're going to be unknowingly picking up functional programming concepts this way. I think that's something we should all be aware of. And I know not that long ago I said that you should choose what is safe over what is exciting, but I do get excited by new, cool, shiny things and new proposals coming into the ECMAScript spec are no exception here. And so something you will no doubt be familiar with if you've used any functional programming languages in the past is pattern matching. There's a current proposal in for JavaScript at the moment, or ECMAScript I should say. It's only in stage 1, so it's early days and it may not make it, but it's there. And there are some other functional programming features that are also proposed, such as the pipe operator. And obviously this is, as mentioned, a stage 1 proposal for JavaScript. It looks a bit gritty, it's a bit dirty to look at, especially when you were to compare how something like this would work in a language like Elixir, which is a little bit departed from React, but I guess it's important just to keep these things in mind, because as I've mentioned before, the world of JavaScript changes very, very rapidly. And whenever new standards are approved and pulled into spec and then implemented by browsers, it all happens pretty quickly, and people start using these new features very quickly. And so that brings us to the end of React Essentials. Coming up next, we have actually writing modern and opinionated React.